I'm with Misha of Fair UC Now, and we are talking about the UAW-UC academic workers strike, um, which involves almost 50K academic workers. So let's talk about this a little bit. What initiated this strike action? Why has this strike really begun?
So that's an interesting question, because I mean, if you look at our signs, we're technically on strike for unfair labor practices, and it's true that the UC has committed a lot of unfair labor practices in the course of our bargaining. For instance, they raised the wages of a couple people in the union while we were in the middle of bargaining, kind of outside of the contract. That's a violation of labor law. I think it's a violation of federal labor law. So that's kind of one of the things they did. But I would say really the impetus for the strike is simply the fact that in California it's nearly impossible to live, especially with the cost of housing being so high. Kind of the prehistory to the strike is that in 2019, a group of students, mainly centered around UC Santa Cruz, started a wildcat movement, specifically centered around the issue of housing. And their proposal is that our wages should be tied to the cost of housing in the places where we work, in the places where UC campuses are located. And the way they kind of conceptualize the math is that no graduate student employee who works at a UC campus should be paying more than 30% of their salary on rent. Those calculations kind of have changed, but the concept is the same, in that we're not just fighting for a raise would be good, but fundamentally what we're fighting for is for the UC to pay us in line with the cost of living in California. And this is especially poignant considering the fact that the UC is the largest landlord in California. So when they raise the rent, whatever gains we make at the bargaining table could be easily taken away by the UC just raising the rent. Especially, it has market effects, but also that's especially the case for graduate students who live in UC housing.
I think this is an important point because this happened in Georgia too, shortly after I left. During the economic downturn in 2007, a lot of universities bought a lot of blighted neighborhood and turned them into basically rental change to shore up their endowments. And in a lot of states, the largest landlords are going to be either the owners of private prisons or the university system. And I pointed this out to people that, like, for example, the largest land contractor for the federal government is actually a private prison contractor. After that, it is subcontracting through, for example, universities. And that makes this particularly vicious, right? Because they can company town you basically.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially what it is that UC Berkeley is a company town, and all these other places in which UC campuses are located are also company towns. And that, like, for instance, at UC Berkeley, the units that UC Berkeley provides are usually below market value, or the rent is below market value, but they're below market value by very little, and they consistently raise the rent every year. And so that, the UC has a lot of power to actually affect the rental market, especially in a place like Berkeley, to make the area more livable, but it simply refuses to do that. the argument that has been put forward by the UC is that, we have a hand to play in fixing the rental crisis by building more housing. Well, when they build more housing, they control that housing, and what have they done in the past? They've essentially, risen um, the market value of rental properties in the area.
Yep, this is a long-term trend I've noticed in a lot of these kind of situations, and I have surprised people haven't been noticing more. You hear people occasionally talking about foreign investment chains buying this stuff up, but people have not been noticing that hospitals, universities, and actually here in Utah, the LDS Church even have become major landholders and major landlord, uh, uh, major landlord tenant clusters. Basically, a lot of them are slumlords, and some of this was done off of positive investment in the community as the rationale. Like that's how they sold it 15 years ago. And I want people to understand what academic laborers make. When I know it's much better now, and I'm going to caveat this: public sector university workers in my home state of Georgia cannot unionize; it is illegal. But there are private university unions. Ironically, so if you go to a private school in Georgia, you're more likely to be in a union like the UAW.
Which is the opposite of the national trend, I think.
Right. It's a fluke of weird law. But we were getting paid. Now, adjust for 3 to recently 7 to 10% inflation, and 15 years, but we were getting paid $1,000 per class per semester, plus remitted tuition with no benefits.
And how many classes did you usually have to teach a semester?
3 or 4. So we might make $4,000 a semester. So we made less than basically about $1,000 a month. And now rent in Georgia is in a university town used to be significantly cheaper than California. That is no longer as true. Mm-hmm. But basically 60% of my income went to rent, and we had to use loans to pay for food.
Yeah. I mean, what you described, I can't imagine any of my coworkers living on $3,000, $4,000 a semester. Mm-hmm. But essentially, that's what people pay, is 60% of their income on rent. So the math ends up being the same.
Right. And you guys had to claw tooth and nail to get benefits from these universities too. I want people to know that.
Yeah.
Like health insurance and all this stuff actually came out of unionization waves about 5-6 years ago. And before that, it's something that I think people, I do think a lot of leftists know it because a lot of leftists are academics, but I think in general people don't understand how parasitic a lot of the university structure is. And I also, I talk about why there's kind of an anti-intellectual streak a lot of times in the working class. And part of that's because their experience of universities is they buy up the city, they raise the rents, they don't really contribute much to the city directly, except maybe in federal contracts. And also the students are poor and they live in crappy housing, and they're also associated with that too. So
yeah. Well, that's an interesting point about kind of the anti-intellectualism that universities foment, because one of the things that I've been reflecting on during the course of the strike is the fact that to an extent our strike is proving that there isn't this kind of animosity against intellectual laborers, if you would call graduate students intellectual laborers, on the part of blue-collar working class people. And what we've seen is actually massive amounts of support from people like the Teamsters, from the ILWU, the longshoremen who work in Oakland. We've seen a lot of support from construction workers who are unionized in various different guilds and unions. And so,
you mean the blue collar workers don't hate the PMC? Is that what you're saying? I'm sorry, I'm being an asshole, but like,
I mean, I think the rough generalization that I've come to is that kind of animosity is something that's generated and something that is an aspect of electoral politics, and that people are keyed into that mindset whenever we're keyed into the mindset of electoral politics, which is most of the time, because usually we're not engaged in economic warfare and labor struggles. But when there is a labor struggle, then that animosity, it kind of, in my opinion, it kind of dissolves, because people actually see, like graduate students at UC Berkeley, some of them make like $32,000 a year, and that's not much less. In fact, it's not much more, and I think it's actually less than what a lot of blue collar workers make. And I think in part they sympathize with the fact that we make essentially below, well, not really below, but we essentially make minimum wage.
Yeah, you basically make whatever the local minimum wage is. And when I did it, we made below minimum. Actually, calculated, we made below minimum wage. And they would like, well, but we're paying for your education, so you should thank us for it. And I'm like, yeah, but we're having to take out debt just to stay in school, because you also make us sign waivers saying we can't take on additional employment. So, like, it's a shit situation, and I think there's real animus towards the universities. I do. I think that's real. I think that's more than electoral, but part of it comes from the fact that people do know that, like, they're buying whole tracts of town, gentrifying it, and not giving much back, at least directly. And like around here, for example, the university has there's only two systems in which you get healthcare. There's one private system and there's the university system, like in Utah. And so there's ways in which, of course, the university is associated with a whole lot of unfortunate things. And I think in electoral politics, that backlashes onto academics. And yes, we also all know snooty professors with tenure, and I think I hated them more when I was either an adjunct or a TA than I ever did later. So,
yeah, no, definitely universities are a very large source of gentrification in the communities in which they're located. I think in UC Berkeley, I mean, the university is so tied with the city itself, and just the dynamics of the Bay Area in general have made it so that we don't see any type of resistance to that anymore, except for in People's Park, which is a park which was associated with the protest culture of UC Berkeley and with the free speech movement. Currently, it's kind of a homeless encampment, and UC Berkeley has been trying to build on it, has been trying to evict the people who live there. And so that's kind of the last area in which we see that type of resistance when it comes to gentrification, when it comes to housing. And part of the rhetoric from the university has been like, we have to gentrify, or we have to push the people out of People's Park if you want housing in general to be cheaper, which is kind of ridiculous because they have the ability just to lower the rents of all the units that they control in Berkeley and in other communities that surround the campus.
Right. Although we know they don't really do that because they're afraid of their trustees, if nothing else. Like, I think this leads us to a lot of interesting things to talk about. One is the areas of union growth recently have been academic, service sector, logistics. Logistic unions, Teamsters, those kinds of unions, they're still kind of struggling, although they're still fairly strong unions compared to other sectors of the economy. But with the Amazon workers and Amazon United, and that's a complete union, you've seen a lot of growth. I think the academic unions are interesting because it's not something that's expected, and I think a lot of people don't know. There are a lot of states in which it's just outright illegal, and the culture of adjuncts and TAs is different from the culture of, say, public school teachers, and so the demands are often quite different. But we've been having similar, issues to you. Like you were talking about, there's having to be some restructuring of this contract because your initial demand was something like keeping housing costs around 30% of your income. We, for example, had our union sell us on a 5% raise, which is historically quite good for Utah. But when you actually factor in we were dealing with 8% inflation, it's a net loss.
Yeah.
And the union lost a lot of credibility actually over that. So what I was going to ask you is the UAW still oppositional bargaining?
Define a bit what you mean by that.
So, for example, in most teachers' unions, they take non-oppositional bargaining. I mean, they take this idea that they need to collaborate with HR and public administration and politicians to generate a contract, and they tend to work in concert. So much so, for example, that a lot of the unions will settle their contract, and the school will announce it as valid before we've even voted to accept it. Because they just don't expect any opposition.
I see.
This is not. I don't want to put your union on the spot, but it does sound like you're still oppositionally bargaining. Like you're actually making pretty significant demands.
Yeah, I mean we're still on strike, and definitely I think we'll have a very lively exchange about whether we should accept the contract that is reached in bargaining. And so I don't think that the membership is so kind of checked out that whatever contract comes to us we'll just accept.
Good.
And I generally think, yes, we're still kind of in a mode of oppositional bargaining, where we draw the line in terms of what is a productive concession and what is a non-productive concession is still something that's debated. So for me, I mean, the UC has not put forward a proposal yet which beats inflation. Essentially, they're not bargaining in good faith until they put forward a proposal which meets inflation, which I believe now is like 13%, if I'm not incorrect.
I think nationally it's not that high. In fact, nationally I've seen it dip back down to 7, but I do believe in the Bay Area it is still quite high, particularly in housing, because housing inflation is going to be like 13, 14, sometimes more. I mean, here in Utah, frankly, partly because of California, we've had like 20, 30% housing inflation a year. Yeah. So even though our net inflation rate's like 7 or 8 for like consumer goods, about 13% for food, our housing inflation has been obscene. And it seems like it's not quite as high in the Bay Area, but that's just because you were already at a point that was like,
which was already ridiculous.
Right. You're already one of the most expensive places to live in the world. So, you can't go up 30% from that, but yes.
Yeah. And so that's kind of the line that I personally draw in terms of like, when we could start making productive concessions. Because in, any in any bargaining scenario, you're going to have to make some type of concession. That's just part of how it works. But are you making concessions just to signal that you're willing to negotiate, or are you making concessions because you see that the other side is starting to kneel, essentially?
Mm-hmm. So, what are some of, in addition to the pay raises, what are some of the demands? Like what were the particular business practice, labor practices that got you there, even if it's, even if it was not the primary thing motivating the strike?
So in terms of the other demands, well, definitely wages has been the central one. Childcare is also a big one. For non-residents, the elimination of any fees. That's a big one, and that's something that particularly applies to international students, because I don't believe they could actually, I might be wrong on this, but I don't believe they could actually declare residency within the state of California while they're getting their education. So that's something that's particularly important for them. And in terms of certain like non-economic demands, there's been some movement around harassment, and I guess we could put it under the broad category of like bullying, especially when it comes to professor graduate student relationships. So that's kind of been what people have been mobilized around.
One thing I think people don't understand is if you've not been in academia, I like to describe being a TA in a PhD program as being basically a serf. Because also one of the things that you will do most of the research for this professor who like has this cushy job and is only teaching like a 3-3 load. And for those who are not in academia, that means 3 classes a semester, another 3 classes a semester. And yes, they're doing massive amounts of research. It's not to say they're not working. But and they will also claim a lot of your research for their, they might give you a thanks or a footnote, but you will have done tons of research for them while trying to finish your own dissertation. And you're in a rat race mentality, which like I actually liken, the only other time I've experienced those sorts of conditions was in a cult.
Yes.
Where like I'm constantly tired. I always have to do something for somebody in authority. There's never a time where I shouldn't be working. And even as a high school teacher with a second gig, I have not been in that world since being a grad student. When I was a grad student, I gained a ton of weight. I developed an unhealthy alcohol drinking problem. And it also ruined everyone's marriage. Like,
yes.
I mean, like I knew we had in a cohort of 20, we had 8 people come in married, and 3 years out, 1 person was still married. So like, it's an incredibly exploitative system. And I don't think people realize that, like, and the whole thing's based off this. It's kind of, some of it's because you have capitalist exploitation and then basically medieval guild exploitation coming together in an unholy hybrid form. And thus is what you got. And unfortunately, you also kind of have to feel bad for the professors because they kind of know when they leave, a lot of them aren't getting replaced with anyone on tenure track. They may get replaced with a full-time lecturer. They'll probably be replaced with a bunch of adjuncts. So
yeah, in our department, we've definitely had. I'm pretty sure our Polish line has been cut. So I'm in it's called Slavic Languages and Literatures. So we cover Russian is obviously the main language, but ideally we should have a professor which teaches Polish literature, because it's the other big Slavic literary tradition. Now we have professors who teach Russian literature, and we have one professor which teaches Yugoslav literature. So that's kind of the only non Russian.
You don't even have like a Bulgarian literature as a distant Bulgarian ethnic. I am slightly offended. No.
Well, I think you would be offended by a lot of things. My department at UC Berkeley in general. I mean, I think what you're saying is very true. The dynamics of my department might be a little bit different because it's extremely small, and the program that they've developed is that it's very coursework intensive, and also it's very exam intensive in that you get these reading lists and you have to mow through them and you take exams on them. We have 2 exams, so a master's exam and then a qualifying exam. And so actually graduate students really start seriously doing research, doing any activity that relates to research only in their 4th year. And so the opportunities for professors to exploit the research of graduate students are pretty minimal, simply because graduate students can't do a lot of research while they're doing coursework. In addition to that, because it's literature, there's not a lot of research that's done that's very menial, because all of it is essentially reading books, your interpretation of books. Right. I guess like graduate students could produce bibliographies, and they do produce bibliographies, but it's not like in a laboratory in which you're kind of putting samples in over and over and over again. Right. But definitely that situation takes place much more in the sciences, in which people are essentially treated as serfs to their professors, to their PIs. And so that's kind of been something that's been motivating people on the science side a lot.
Yeah, in history, it's somewhere in between. I have some friends who are history PhDs, and they're often doing archival work for their professor's latest article while also trying to do a dissertation. And usually the archival work is barely related to what they do, but it's not like what I hear horror stories about paper billing and stuff in science labs. I was an MFA, so if anyone no one was going to steal my stuff. But it's an interesting thing to talk about, and we will later on talk a little bit about what you study, because I am fascinated with all things Slavic. I used to be a Russophile before it was uncool.
It's become extremely uncool. Yeah.
I'm still a Russophile. I'm a Slavophile. And I do have a ethnic partisan bias for Southern Slavs because we have better food, but I don't think
Turks to thank for that. So.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the other way around. Who knows?
No. I think we do have the Turks to thank. We have the Turks to thank to that, and the Greeks, but this is not to demean. We go off on a weird Slavic tangent, but we'll get to that later. I do think conditions for academic labor has actually gotten a lot better in the last 10 to 15 years. I mean, like when I was talking about even in California, like when I was a grad student, nobody had insurance. Like we didn't have medical insurance. Like we were just all like really worried about getting sick all the time. And yeah, we had access to the university medical facilities if you had one. And it was reduced prices, but like the clinic was literally like somebody comes and looks at you and is like, no, you're not dead. Are you pregnant? No. Okay. Like that was kind of it. Do you need psychiatric services? Well, yeah, we probably all do, but we can provide those. Otherwise, you have to go to the hospital, and we'll give that to you for a reduced price, but not for free. And so it was kind of a really dire situation. And there were several times where I almost went back to being a pizza manager as opposed to stay in grad school, because I was just like, the pay here is so bad that it hardly seems worth it. Okay,
Yeah.
so in California, this is particularly pernicious because, like you said, you might make $42,000 a year, but a one bedroom apartment can be $3,000 a month. What do you do about that? And you're also paying the money, even if you're not in student housing, to the university anyway. Because in Berkeley, in particular, the university almost has a landlord lock. So
Yeah. I mean, there are private landlords, and
yeah, of course.
Berkeley. I mean, essentially, what graduate students have had to do is disperse to cheaper parts of the Bay Area, Oakland, Richmond, um, places a little bit, east of the Bay Area. I think a lot of people even commute from like Stockton, Sacramento, which, if you could imagine, that's like 2 hours one way. This is, of course, complicated if uh, you don't know how to drive a car, or you don't have a car. A car is an extra expense that you have to take care of. I personally, despite living in California, do not know how to drive a car, so I'm kind of bound to public transit.
BART stocks.
Yes, and public transit is very unreliable, and
it's actually weirdly expensive in the Bay Area too. Like, it's not as expensive as driving, but when I was abroad, when I lived in South Korea and even in Egypt and in Mexico, I came back to the Bay Area to visit my ex-wife family and some friends who live in Oakland actually, and I got on BART and I was like, it's like $7 to take what? Like,
yeah,
and this was probably 7 or 8 years ago. I know it's worse now. And recently also I was in San Diego and wanted to take a train to San Diego to LA and back, and it was like one way $78.
yeah.
And I was just like,
So yeah,
wow.
one of the things that we do have is that we do have bus passes,
Good.
which are provided by the university. Some of us randomly got free BART passes, which I don't know why they did that. I don't know why they didn't just give it to everybody, considering that everybody uses the BART at some point. Yeah, but public transit is not a strong point when talking about California. I wanted to kind of touch on what you were saying about the improvements that have been made to academic labor in general, in that part of it is emerging from like a conceptual shift, in that it used to be that graduate students were seen as apprentices. They weren't really seen as full employees. They were seen as as students, and you have a little bit of teaching on the side, mainly for experience, but also for some pocket change. Now that is shifting, so that people are beginning to conceptualize graduate student labor as a job in and of itself. And I think that's happening for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's happening because the academic job market is shrinking. And so graduate school is the one opportunity that people actually have to practice their craft and to work as academic laborers. The second thing is that because the economy in general, especially the economy for young people, has been getting so bad, a 6-year contract with a big, stable, potentially prestigious institution like UC Berkeley doesn't actually seem so bad. So, like when I was graduating college, and I graduated from a pretty good liberal arts college, Reed, if you know about it.
I know about Reed.
But like my options were essentially work service or go to grad school. And this was during the COVID-19 pandemic, so I chose grad school. My other option was to go to Russia. And I'm very glad I did not go to Russia. So kind of my minimum wage job at UC Berkeley is the best that I could get. And that's kind of one argument that the university and that some faculty, that some tenured professors use, is like, whenever you're saying, like, you know, whenever you start hinting to people that maybe I'll quit, maybe I'll find another job, they say, like, it's not better on the other side. And you don't know what the other side is like, especially if you haven't had any experience, if you've only experienced academic institutions.
True, although I know this is an unpopular sentiment, but I actually prefer being a public school teacher to being an academician, and I'm one of the few weirdos who does. But
well, I don't think that's controversial, though.
No, I don't think it is anymore. It was a few years. It was actually when I was in college, and there was a whole lot of my tenure professors would be like, "We invested so much in you, and all you're going to do is be a high school teacher." And I was like, "How do you think you get your students, man?" Like, but it is interesting to see, because I think people don't realize, like, for now, for example, for a whole lot of people who get their PhD, they're geared for a private sector consulting job that's going to be okay pay. I mean, maybe even decent pay. I'm not crying over PhDs, don't get me wrong. But it's not what they were promised, and a lot of people know they don't really have a future. And one of my frustrations actually with these academic institutions is they have not accepted that, and yet they're totally dependent on the student labor. So a lot of these programs do not, for example, prepare you to go into multiple tracks of employment. Like, they are assuming you will be an academic. And I'm like, but you know the stats for that, right? And you know you over accept into these programs. Now, maybe not in Slavic literature, because there's probably like not that many of you, but you know, a lot of these departments are getting cut. And if they're getting cut at a place like Berkeley, like at a mid-tier state school, that you also need to have increasingly, like, I'll tell people this way. At Georgia Military Academy, the head of the department, the years I was there, was just a master's degree holder from a local school.
Yeah.
5-6 years later, they're hiring Oxford dons and Harvard people. Like, that's how quickly and how extremely the academic job market, particularly in the humanities, change. But it's also becoming true in STEM, despite what you hear about the STEM shortage, which I think is totally manufactured, except in coding. And so, you know, I think there's a whole lot that these academic researchers have to be upset about, because they're also keeping the universities open, since not even to get into the administrative overhead and what these administrators are doing. Because, you know, they're not, like, a lot of these institutions are moving further and further away from any educational mission, really, or even doing government research, to like basically being major landholders and doing things like that. So I think this is where I'm highly sympathetic to academic labor, because for a lot of you, this will be your only time in academia. It was mine, like, and I was not like a poor student. I did well. I was, you know, I had good grades. But when I realized that if I didn't go to an Ivy League school, and as a former working class kid, that was not going to happen, that I really had the best I could possibly hope for was the community college gig, and you know, it pays okay, actually, but that seemed pretty bleak. Like,
yeah. Just to pick up on your last point, one of the things I've noticed in academia, especially in the humanities, is that you essentially have to be bred from the beginning of your life to actually succeed in academia in a humanities program.
Totally agree.
Not like, I went to private religious school up until high school. I went to a public high school, but still a very good public high school, and I went to a private college, and still I feel like I'm behind my colleagues who've had private educations, and on top of that, who have parents who themselves work in academia. And so
I think this is another point where like the resentment of academics really does come in, because you see essentially not explicit nepotism, but structural nepotism. And this is not even dealing with like, at the private universities, 40% of white students are literally legacy admits, which also means they're not admitting working class white students at all. But they honestly a lot of times don't have the skills for it. I did not realize how many things it was just assumed I was going to know, even with a good college education in grad school, until I was in grad school. And it was one of the times where I had the most like class resentment. Like,
yeah.
Somebody's in the chat, someone's like, what in what ways are people who are not bred for this behind? I will say one of them is that you often have to do a whole lot of free labor, and to get the skills to also compete, you need internships and stuff like that, which means you need people to support you. But what other ways? Because I think there's a lot.
I think this is a formulation I've come to recently. What being in an elite atmosphere allows you to do is it allows you to pose an argument without being argumentative. It allows you to produce research that is substantive, but that people aren't exactly sure how they're supposed to respond to it in terms of like a counterpoint.
Right. Well, I mean, one thing you'll notice about the way academics cost is it's damn near impossible to get them to say anything concrete. Like
that's one of the strategies I use.
Right.
In terms of creating this environment in which like having an argument, having a discussion is usually almost impossible. Every once in a while you get a professor that's kind of, has a very argumentative spirit, but usually the arguments are not really about the structure of, the paper or the research that's being done, but usually the arguments are about, the legitimacy of the research itself.
Right.
And usually when the legitimacy of the research itself is questioned, the argument used is you're studying something that is not part of elite culture. We recently had a colloquium in which an author was being discussed who lived on welfare for a couple of years in the United States, or who lived on welfare most of his time while he was living in while he was living in the United States. He was a Soviet immigrant, and one of the arguments that was used against that research project, that book, was essentially, why are you studying someone who lived on welfare? And this is something,
this is interesting because I've seen this too, and people think that there is a love of, victimhood in academia, but I've pointed out it's only certain kinds of victimhood. Like, particularly economic hardship, or people who do not have cultural capital and still manage to succeed or do significant intellectual things, are not generally respected in humanities culture. I will say it's a little bit better in the sciences. Honestly, they are a little bit more objective about this, but and I think people are shocked when they hear that, because they think, because we're always looking for like some obscure like neurodivergent working class black literature from the 19th century, or, like as and you'll see like paper calls for that. I'm exaggerating, but I bring it up because I've seen something very close to that. And yet when you go and start doing like, okay, I want to do something on like, I don't know, working class feminism in literature, you'll get pushback because the authors are not considered legitimate or legitimately contributory. You might get away with it in history, and it's often confusing to people, like, because they're kind of being if you don't know the code, you're being gaslit, honestly. Another one is like diversity statements. I know people bring this up all the time, but like a lot of them, you have to write them in a certain way, and they kind of weed out even working class people of color because they don't know how to write them. And yet it seems like it's being all inclusive and this, that, and the other, but it's actually not. It leads to a whole lot of perverse incentive systems in academia that don't exist in general society. And I do think, like, when people complain about like latte liberals or something stupid like that, this is something that they kind of half understand. They kind of half see it. But you really have to be in there to see it. And if you're actually from, I'd say even a middle class background, not even a working class background, and you hit these walls, you're going to be kind of shocked at first. And then because I remember for me, I was sold that academia was a meritocracy, and I truly believed it until grad school. Like, that was the moment where I was like, no, it's not. It's not at all. Like this is, they will occasionally let some of us from outside of academia work up to prove that they have a conscience or some shit, but there's a limit to it, and you better figure it out real fast. And I think you're also right. I talked about this book by Smith, Disciplined Minds, but that people think academia trains you to communicate, but a lot of times it actually trains you how not to communicate in particular ways. And yes, there's a rigor to it. And yes, I mean, like, I will admit, I learned how to close read in a way in graduate school that I'm grateful for. But I also had to unlearn how to speak that way, because once I spoke and like, people just thought I was saying nothing most of the time, and I kind of was. Like, and I think you're absolutely right about that. And that's not including all the practical stuff, like, to work in some of these fields, you literally have to go work without pay to get the requisite experience to build your CV. That's not just bad in academia; it's also bad in media and publishing in general. And I think, I mean, ironically, I was reading a study, like, for all the talk that universities do about diversity, there are more students from elite backgrounds in PhD and master's programs now than any other, as a percentage of the student population, than any other time in the history of universities, including when it was pretty much closed off to like outsiders entirely before the GI Bill. And that's kind of shocking to realize. Like, and I think that's what people are getting at. But, you know, the average academic laborer doesn't benefit from that at all, right? Like, you're not getting a lot of benefits from that, particularly if you're not going to get to work in a tenure track profession, because all these habits are things you're going to have to unlearn. So, you know, how does that feel to you as a person working in this field? So, what does that feel true to you? You know, it's totally okay to disagree with me. I'm not an academic.
Well, in terms of, so I think definitely my field is somewhat insulated. And I think a lot of the smaller humanities fields are somewhat insulated just because they're so small. And so when we conceptualize the academic job market, we're not even thinking in terms of percentages, because it's like there are 11 jobs and whatever, 30, 40 people, but it's so much based. It's whether you get a job or not is so much more dependent on the individual person than it is potentially in other fields.
Right. I think that's true for a lot of specialized humanities interest language
Exactly.
programs. Yeah.
Um, and
You just
so,
better not piss off your colleagues because there's only 5.
yeah,
Like,
and so that's another pressure that's exerted in that type of environment, which is so kind of claustrophobic and small. But I definitely think in the larger fields and definitely in the sciences and internships, I think are a much larger part of the sciences. I haven't really seen that many internships in at least in my field. Uh,
there's a lot of them in publishing and literature, and they're kind of required for you to do. However, that's more about getting placements after you're done, or getting, like, being able to say you've written a paper before, if you didn't go to an elite school, that you've gotten a paper done before you got into a PhD program. Because unless you're in a pretty strong master's program, you're usually not asked to produce the kind of work that could be publishable. Um, Now in MFAs, and like, so if you want to go to, for example, a PhD in creative writing, something that I don't think should exist because we have 2 terminal degrees in the field, which bugs
mm,
me. But let's say you do that. And those things, you often need like 2 or 3 books before you enter into the PhD program, and you're having to do them either while you're working or on some residency somewhere or something like that, almost like a postdoc, but it's not really that. Um, and a lot of times those are very low paid or not paid at all, or you're having to take sabbaticals from other kinds of work to finish the work. And so increasingly, the people who are able to do that are well off. And so I don't think, and I think, for example, a lot of people in my field go into publishing, not in the straight academia, because there's no jobs for us in academia. And publishing has even more of these internships and stuff than even academia does.
but yeah,
But
publishing is also a very small and dying
yep,
industry.
exactly. It's a
Yeah,
tiny industry with no profit margin whatsoever. Like, if I told people when I worked for Zero, when I contracted, because they didn't even have the money to hire us directly, for Zero Books, what we made, they would, well, I'll say it now. We made £10 a book. So for every book we did a review on, we got £10. That's how we got paid. Like, and when I started, the pound was stronger, so it was a little bit better. But when I left, it was like nothing. Um, we made more money doing media to promote the books than we made off the books and processing or selling them.
yeah,
And with literary books, like in poetry, for example, almost all the publishers are publishing at a loss. Even with little stocks and stuff like that, it's mostly based off of who you know and who you can get a grant from. And all the poets are hoping to get a university reading, because that will be how you actually make your money. You will get you'll get a flight out, an airplane, and like $600 to $1,000 to do the reading, and honestly, a lot of that is also knowing somebody. I've done a couple of those, but in general, there's no money in it, and the people who do it pretty much have to have money. So it's an incredibly shrinking group of people who can perform in this space at the ability to publish enough to get tenure track jobs. And they often have to be in the wilderness for a while.
yeah. And I think part of the problem, kind of on a more macro scale, is that so much of our cultural output, literary output, has been centralized into universities,
Yep.
and that you know contemporary writers, famous contemporary writers, popular contemporary writers, are usually professors in MFA programs. or in writing departments. People essentially have to go through these programs to publish anything. And what essentially it produces is a literature that is extremely narrow,
Right.
and that you don't actually have people who are outside of academia and who are thinking of literature in a non-academic way.
And they're also thus not studied. I mean, this is the other thing. So like you're going to have if, like, for example, someone wanted to write a dissertation on, I don't know, me, which I'm still alive, so it's inadvisable anyway. But let's say from 30 years and now, they find my obscure ass books and want to do a dissertation on me. They're going to have a problem doing that because I don't have a literary reputation in academia.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm probably also not famous enough to have breached that wall. So if you reach a certain level of fame, like you're Stephen King, eventually, with reluctance, people will take you in as a subject of study. But it takes a while, and it's resented. So, you know, there's a whole lot to deal with there. Now, I don't really care if anyone ever writes a dissertation on my work because that's not why I do it. But I know that, and I've seen it. Like, I've seen people try to do, even recently dead authors who are genre authors, are considered outside of literary culture. And sometimes, I hate to say this, academic fads will cut in that direction, but it's only usually for a little while. So,
Yeah.
What are you going to do?
In Russia, it's an interesting situation. I'm kind of far off the topic of the strike, but it's an interesting conversation. In Russia, it's interesting because, there was a transition from the Soviet model, in which there was the Union of Writers and, party line when it came to literature, and obvious restrictions as a result of that. But now the literary system, well, not a literary system, is completely different because of the war, and most contemporary writers are not, they don't live in Russia, they're in exile, and they mainly publish on Facebook because it's the only place that really you could publish.
I was going to ask you about that because I feel like 10 years ago I was hearing much more about contemporary Russian literature, and it seems like lately I haven't heard a damn thing. Like, maybe authors, it's me. Like Victor Pelinin and a lot of there were a lot of expat authors basically, but they were writing in Russian, and lately I've just not seen the same, except for people who are complaining about how evil Putin is or something. I haven't seen the same interest. I haven't seen stuff being translated, and there doesn't seem to be a large literary output. And I was going to ask you about that separately.
Yeah. So I don't study contemporary Russian literature.
I don't blame you.
And I mean, we have a contemporary Russian poet, very well-known, very important contemporary Russian poet in our department, and also who's a member of the faculty. And also we have an important contemporary Russian poet who is one of the grad students. Cool. So they know more about this than I do. So just to respond to your point in terms of our perception in the United States, I definitely think the last wave of contemporary Russian literature that we've encountered has been that kind of postmodernist, Sorokin, Pelevin, and there's a certain exoticism to it, because when we think of Russian literature in the United States, we think of the realist novel, or we think of Soviet literature, and we don't think of anything that's potentially, that is so different from that.
Correct.
And so I think that's why potentially figures like Pelevin and Sorokin have become so important in the West. I would put the blame on the US and not Russia. Well, why we aren't turning to Russian culture as a source of resistance against Putinism, or as something that could enlighten how we think about our current situation. And I think partly that's a result of this new mentality where, like in the Cold War, the United States government funded programs of, Eastern European, that studied Eastern European Slavic
Yeah,
literature.
we were all about Russian literature during the Cold War, actually.
Yeah. And the mentality has shifted to the point where in our state of conflict, we don't want to learn about Russia. We just want to ignore, or we just want to, cancel whatever products of Russian literature are out there. And I'm talking about like our mass perception. So obviously people who know anything about Russian poetry or who follow Russian poetry or Russian contemporary prose know that like, I would say that, definitely most of the contemporary poets are against the war.
Yeah, I would. I would say it's somewhat hard to follow Russian contemporary poetry because so little of it is now translated, and I do think that is our fault. Like, this is not to blame Russianists or Russians at all. I don't. I will say I don't. I do think, the Russian government has not been a good caretaker in promoting Russian culture abroad, but in general,
I think maybe I could speak a little bit more to this in terms of
yes, please.
Because film in the Soviet Union was something which was funded at a much more funded much more generously than in contemporary Russia.
For sure. And it shows too, actually.
Yeah. And the dynamics of Soviet culture made it so that, most of the films obviously would follow some type of party line, but you would have like Tarkovsky, who, because of his individual popularity and fame and the fact that he won all these film prizes, would allow him to continue producing that which he produced.
Right.
I'm not personally a big Tarkovsky fan, but when we think of kind of Russian art cinema, that is who we tend to think of. After the collapse of the Soviet
Union, I am a big Tarkovsky fan, but
okay,
but that's okay.
I don't. My taste in films is very. It's not very sophisticated, so But regardless, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because the Russian market was infiltrated with all of these foreign films, then they didn't have to invest that much in their own film industry. And so now when we do have Russian-sponsored films, or films that are sponsored by the Russian state, we have films like, when I was in Russia, I saw something that was titled, in English, it's The Lenin Factor.
I've heard of this, actually.
Yeah. So essentially kind of this, how should we call it, creative historical recounting of the Russian Revolution. That's putting it generously.
Creative or historical recounting as an anti-communist propaganda.
Yes. It's essentially anti-communist propaganda. I saw it in theaters. I mean, any opportunity that I get to see a film representation of the Russian Revolution, I take it.
Oh yeah, me too.
Because what good films do we have about the Russian Revolution? Like, we have Reds, which is a pretty good film. We have
but the Russian Revolution part's like 15 minutes. So yeah, we have Reds.
All of Eagles. That's a television series, which I think is pretty good in some parts, but it's not solely dedicated to the Russian Revolution.
No, but it's okay.
Yeah, and aside from that, not much. On Netflix, there was the Trotsky series, which is kind of...
Oh my god, it was bad.
It's kind of the high point of this creative historical recounting of the Russian Revolution. I don't think Trotsky ever killed a rabbit, or it's just completely, and it doesn't verge on anti-Semitic. It is anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I was watching it and I was like, somehow this managed to combine both Russian and US anti-communist sentiment and also weird anti-Jewish sentiment that a lot of people in the U.S. won't pick up on.
Yeah.
That I was like, this is a match made in hell for reactionaries. But I actually weirdly was like, but I don't get a lot of stuff from Russia to watch all that much, so I'm gonna watch it. Like,
Yeah, and I think like if you like take out the fact that it's essentially fiction and that it's anti-Semitic, it portrays Trotsky as someone who he was not. Um, if you completely divorce it from its historical context, it's nice to watch. It's it's kind of it's eye candy, but it's good eye candy.
Yeah, I always wanted at least the Russian equivalent to Bollywood to come over here. Like I wanted like crazy bear historical revisionist movies that we can't tell are reactionary, but are at least fun. Like MMM, that movie. Like and we haven't got that either. So it's I feel like Russian culture and Slavic culture in general is very poorly represented in the United States, partly as a result of the Cold War. But the thing is, you're right. During the Cold War, we actually invested intellectual resources to, understanding the Soviet mind. Um, and some of the scholarship was shitty, but some of it was good, and particularly on the arts. And yes, that's completely declined. We were talking in the beginning about how I felt like, you're in a Slavic studies department and you don't have anyone who teaches Bulgarian or even Polish. And I'm like, well, let's recount the Slavic nations that should be represented in a Slavic studies department, because there's like, I don't know, 20 or something.
Yeah.
Like we need the Slovaks and the Slovenes, Yugoslav literature. I mean, that's kind of cool, but like there hasn't been a Yugoslavia in a while. Serbian, Croatian. I mean, we could go through it. Different forms of Russian. I mean, one of the things that I'm fascinated with, and I know enough about Russian history to know that I don't know it very well, but like Russian regional differences, Russian historic, like different Russian ethnic and religious groups, etc., are not something that in the U.S. that are actually really appreciated anymore. It kind of was during the Soviet period, not anymore.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about dialect,
Mm-hmm.
The line that I've heard, I mean, there do exist various Russian dialects, but I do not think they're as pronounced as English dialects. And partly that has to do because of the Soviet Union and because of
standardization
of the Russian language, the changes that were made to the orthography, so on and so forth. But there definitely do exist regional Russian dialects, and those regional Russian dialects do definitely play a part in literature. And this is especially the case, it's the case in 20th century literature, in 19th century literature, when you read something like Tolstoy's Cossacks. To me, I mean, I'm not a native speaker of Russian, so every Russian book I read is a little bit of a challenge. But Cossacks, in which Tolstoy tries to write in this dialect, it was almost completely ununderstandable.
Interesting.
Then there's also the question of minority languages within Russia, within the Soviet Union, within the Russian Empire. People who wrote in minority languages, and also people who spoke minority languages, but who ended up writing in Russian. And so the primary case of this, or at least one of the large cases of this, is Isaac Babel, who was someone who spoke Yiddish. He came from the Odessa region in what is now Ukraine, but he decided to write in Russian. And so a lot of analysis has been done in terms of looking at how Yiddish comes through the Russian text, in terms of syntax, in terms of intonation, in terms of vocabulary. And so that's that's a direction in which Slavic studies is heading, I would say.
That's kind of exciting, but also very niche.
Yeah. Well, Babel, at least in Slavic studies, is not niche.
No,
yeah.
Obviously, but
yeah. Huge presence. I mean, probably a little bit overemphasized.
And it would probably sell well in the West too, because we like talking about Yiddishite culture. So I mean, there's things you can do with that. I think this is interesting though, because one of the things that I think it tells us, and this does relate to the strike, is government investment in things like the humanities. During the Cold War, it was seen as a national security issue. And at least for academics, even if they were producing weird anti-Soviet tracts for the public, like they wanted the academics to actually know shit, like really know stuff. It was seen as important to understand. That has largely dried up. There was a little bit of that, I think, 15 years ago around Arabic literature, but it like faded real fast. And yeah, I have wondered if that's partly just because of the state of the university. And I was going to ask you about that. Like, do you think the state of the, like, yes, there are cultural elements to this. Yes, there's this current for a while to like, Russians are cool to hate again, even if you're a liberal, which really bugs me, because I do actually have a kind of deep and perverse love for Slavic studies in general. Like I'm like fascinated with Slavic history. It's a part of my background. It's only like it's not even most of my background. I'm just as much Scottish as I am Bulgarian in heritage. And let's be honest, my family's been in America for like 200 years. We barely have any ties to the modern nation states in any of these places. Like I am aware, I'm not a dumb American in that way, but it is interesting to see how this is degenerated in the humanities kind of severely, because while there's still, I'm sure there's still great research going on in Slavic studies, there isn't a lot of money going into it.
Yeah. No, that's very accurate. And as I said, like that paradigm has changed, in which we don't view the humanities as part of our as a way of securing or as a way of bettering our national security. Now that Cold War paradigm obviously is not good.
No,
I just
not good
I just want to make that clear. I don't want to say like because people have said, and people
we want our Cold War back so people will study Slavic literature.
Well, that's essentially the line.
No,
seriously said. But people have definitely hinted to it that maybe it's good that there are more tensions between Russia and the United States, because people will pay more attention to Russia, will get more funding. And I think, Russian and Slavic studies in general has had a little bit of an advantage just because of the legacy of the Cold War. And there are still federal grants which do help, like FLAS. Which particularly, those grants target languages that are not as well known in the U.S. Russian is obviously one of those languages, along with many other Slavic languages. Yeah. But those, yeah.
Yeah, I tend to have I think a lot of people in the U.S. have a bias to think that Slavic languages are really hard. And
yeah,
I don't know.
I actually
don't know. I've been told by Russian speakers that it's actually not as hard as I think it is, but I'm always like, I don't know, man. I don't know. Like, people told me that about German too, and while I'm okay at reading it, it's still pretty difficult. So to tie it back to the strike, and I did want to talk to you about your studies, because I do think I'm worried that the humanities as we have known them are barely going to exist in the next 20-30 years. Like they're just getting cut to ribbons. The people who working them are now pretty much grad students, and they a lot of them do not actually expect to have employment in their field after they leave. And I yes, there's a part of even me who wants to watch the universities burn down in flames, but I actually don't want to lose all the scholarship and cultural knowledge, and particularly on things like languages, other cultures, political history. I mean, one of the rants I go on, because of the legacy of the Cold War, interestingly, there's a lot of Russian communist text translated, but like even easy language, I say easy, even languages that are commonly spoken in the US, like German, there's like most of the Second International's papers are not translated into English. It's like it's maddening actually, because it's like, but why? And I also know this is true for contemporary Russian stuff. There's just a whole lot that we don't get good translations of. Yes, Google Translate's not totally shitty when it comes to Russian. I can use it sometimes to figure stuff out, but it's weird. I often don't get context. And it leads to me playing guessing games on what the context is. Because I used to, like, one of the things I used to do to try to get a feel for things going on in Russia when I was living in South Korea was to go on LiveJournal.
Very popular amongst Russians.
Very popular in Russian. Put it to the Cyrillic setting and then turn on my auto translate and just try to figure it out. Like it was like Cyrillic. I'm going to search in Cyrillic. Okay, I'm going to turn on auto translate. I can't read any of this. And see what I can kind of piece together. And I quit doing it because I was like, I just don't have enough cultural context to follow a lot of this. Like, I just don't. And that's one of the important things of academic translation, is to fill in the cultural context for people who are not native speakers, are just not great at it.
I think sometimes in academia, whether you're in literature or whether you're in history, we forget about that role because we could easily access Russian texts. We don't necessarily need translations, and translation is becoming more popular because people are starting to view it as an alt academic track. Translation is something that is not funded at all.
No, it's not. It's actually mostly funded by the military and not academia. Like,
literary translation.
Not it's just not
historical translation, not at all.
Right.
So for people who think like we're going to become a translator after academia, like you can, but you're not going to make money from it.
Yeah, you're gonna be poor. It's gonna be. I literally know a person who does it from the German text that I was talking about.
Is this Ben?
Yeah, Lewis? Ben Lewis, who does it off of Patreon money. Like, he funds his translation. I mean, he is a professor, but he gets no money for the translation, so he funds his translations off of Patreon money. That's where we're at, people. Like,
yeah, and I think, kind of to take your question, to give you a broader answer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the core of research in the humanities is philological and archival research. And that is very labor intensive. That takes a certain level of training for people to actually be able to do that type of work. And so I think that's definitely something that could only be accomplished within institutional settings. But not in all cases.
Agreed. Yeah, if you're highly motivated, you can still do it. But I will say, it's also, you didn't say this, but I will just say it for you because I've done archival research. It's also very boring. Like,
it's not.
Like, even if you're super interested in it, I mean, literally the process of doing it, getting on your special gloves, sitting there with a pencil, like, because a lot of the stuff hasn't been digitized yet, and going through it, just the process of doing it is boring, even when you're finding interesting information. Particularly, you also just have to sort through, and if you're trained in an institutional setting, you know how to do it. But you also have to sort through tons of information that you're just like the amount of interesting things you can find out from like, I don't know, receipts from labor, from like shipping yards. It's actually really interesting, but getting to the interesting part involves a whole lot of tedium. Like, and it takes special training to like bypass out because the average person is just going to get lost in all the data. You need to be trained on how to zoom in on it. And I do worry that we're losing that as like there's sometimes I worry that we are largely losing a lot of those skills. There's not as many people able to do that as there used to be.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely the case. I would say, in terms of language skills, also, that's something that's been on the decline. In general, I mean, I don't have any statistics to support me. I have anecdotal evidence.
But we are stopping teaching it in schools dramatically. Like I went through the required graduation courses for all 50 states, and very few of them mandate languages anymore at all.
Yeah.
Like, so.
Yeah, and so people are not being trained in that. I would say, though, and this is kind of my optimistic point, although maybe it's not that optimistic, is that a lot of the research that's done in the humanities is stuff that during the beginning of the 20th century was not located within universities.
True.
Close reading.
Absolutely true.
Cultural criticism. This was all stuff that, people took up within cultural circles, literary circles. And it kind of goes to the point that I was making about the fact that all of cultural production has been centralized in universities. That was not always the case. We had people who were not professors who were writing books and who were saying interesting things about books. And I mean, I think what we're seeing, just because of the nature of the academic job market and because of the shrinking of these fields, a lot of people who are trained in that are finding they're living online. So they make content online.
Me.
Yeah, essentially this, which I think is very, obviously it's very useful, but also, making a living online is not very stable. And not everybody
can do it. It's not.
Yeah.
It has bad incentives too, actually. So
yeah,
like it has a lot of perverse incentives. So yes.
Yeah. And so, the problem now is to find a way of exiting the university and of creating these cultural products that people want, people need, in a way that allows for the people who produce those products to exist and to have as few adverse incentives as possible, which is hard to do under capitalism. Well, yes. That's kind of the system that we live in. So, will a solution be found? I don't know. I'm not necessarily sure. It's definitely leading to some interesting things, though, in terms of kind of the directions people are going in terms of scholarship and research, and the boundaries that people are now able to make, knowing that the boundaries that people are able to push, knowing that the things that they're producing, they're not really pitching it to an academic audience anymore. They're pitching it to kind of whatever, an intelligentsia audience.
Yeah, and sometimes thank God for that. I agree with you. It's very hard to do this in capitalism. There's a bunch of perverse incentives. But also, the most demoralizing thing in the world I did as an academic was write a paper, spend years working on a paper that I think 5 people at a conference and 3 peer reviewers and then like maybe 20 people are ever going to fucking read. And it's never going to get cited because 93% of all papers in humanities aren't cited. So it's like,
yeah,
it was a super demoralizing thing. And when I'd be like, well, I can write on this blog or go on this podcast and 5,000 people heard it, and that's on a bad one, you know. And it was, so there are interesting incentives. And actually 10 years ago, I was a little bit more hopeful about like para academia being a meaningful way out. The commodification of social media, as we're now dealing with the collapse of Twitter, which Twitter may still exist as a website, but it is functionally collapsed for now. I don't think has actually ended up being the kind of stable, petite bourgeois venture that we kind of thought it may have been 5-10 years ago. I still think it's worthwhile to do, but I still think it's worthwhile to do because I have a day job. Like this is a way for me to replicate what I liked about academia without replicating what I hated about it. One of which was exactly what you guys are fighting for. I hated being poor. Like it sucks. So, and I also hated like the weird, like labor system in academia, which was, some professors who are making six figures, which admittedly 6 figures doesn't even sound like that much money under current inflation, but, and then others who were, basically subsistence wages, and they're all in the same department. And the students often don't even realize how profound the differences between them are.
Yeah. At least in California, those records are public.
Yes.
So people have seen what their professors make, and the difference is even amongst professors who have received tenure, the time at which they receive tenure determines a lot about how much they make.
Right. Oh, totally. And also whether or not they were in the economics department. Man, I hated those bastards when I was at school. Like, you make $300,000 for writing bullshit. No, but anyway, the way I kind of deal with it, I still am tangentially tied to the university myself, because my partner is a university researcher. That's all she does. She's just a researcher now. She used to be a research writer. She's not in faculty at all. But we do get pretty decent faculty benefits from that, interestingly enough. They're way better than my teacher benefits, like in terms of the insurance available to us. But I know, for example, the adjuncts at that school, even though they now do get benefits, don't get those benefits. Like they get a slightly weaker set of a tier of benefits. And then that's also true for graduate students, I believe. I'm a little bit uncomfortable asserting that as a totally fact, but I think that's true.
Yeah.
So I have historically been somewhat of a burn the academy down. Like people may have been able to quote me on these things. But I've become really supportive of academic labor disputes and also academic staff disputes. So of the people who work for the universities in all kinds of auxiliary capacities, from custodial on up, because I find a lot of the working conditions in the schools to be pretty dire, but they are often sold you off of but some of the private sector is so much worse. And so you feel like you're kind of like, it's like an abusive parent who tells you that like your uncle's going to beat you more, so you should just accept it. And I do think that's a lot of the arguments. And I also think a lot of the professorate has internalized that, even if they think they're good leftists, for example.
Yeah. No, that's definitely the case. And just to illustrate that, when we were on the picket line, someone who was working think in like the library depot, or someone who takes in books from the outside and puts them in the library. He was, I think it's Acme is the name of the union. He was a member of that, or whatever union he was a member of, and he told us, like, keep on striking, because the graduate students are the only labor force within the university large enough to actually pressure the university into doing anything. Because if the Acme, if the janitors and the people who run the facilities, if they strike, yes, it's something that definitely affects the university. But they just don't have the numbers like the graduate students do.
Exactly.
And so that's kind of because university labor is divided up into so many different categories. Not one single category has enough power to make any substantive changes. And so,
yeah, I've actually argued for and there are some teachers unions do this, but one of my big arguments in the teachers unions, it's a big structural change that I want, is for the staff union and the faculty union to become one union, so that we can fight for them too, because they're disempowered because of their numbers, in a similar way. And weirdly, in my state, we accept admin into our union, but we don't accept staff workers. And so, like, we don't know about the struggles of the lunch staff or the custodial unless we really ask. And there are states where it's reversed. I think some of the Midwestern states, there are no admin and there are custodial or in the teachers union. It's not like a educational working staff union. But the thing is, we even get, I will say this, we do get pushback even from union bureaucracy because they don't want to lose an additional bureaucracy. But I'm like, but it's disempowering your ability to advocate for these workers. And I'm not arguing that we should go in and like lay off all the like union employees either. That's not what I want. In fact, one of the funniest things I ever dealt with was trying to deal with union employees fighting the union they worked for. So it was like, and those things happen quite a lot, actually. And when I tell people about this, I think people should know that there's a fine line you have to walk whenever you do this union advocacy stuff. Like, there really is, because you want militancy, you want people to keep on striking. Which, by the way, and I haven't pitched this yet, there is a link if you want to support the UC strikers. There is a link for helping them get through any strike actions. It requires money. People got to eat. So if you want to throw them a few dollars, I'm sure they'd appreciate it. They're about halfway to their goal, and there's 50,000 of them who might need some of this. So, maybe help. So I would appreciate it if you did. I would love not to have to. Lately, I felt like I'm having to pitch like small presses and like GoFundMe's and whatnot, but it's just like, this is the world we live in. So I am definitely rooting for you. Once this is negotiated and done, I might ask you and maybe one of your comrades to come on again and kind of fill us in on how you felt like it went. I know that you're probably not going to get everything you're asking for, but keep striking until you get something like you. I agree. Like when you're talking about cost of housing and they refuse to even meet inflation, that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like,
we'll refuse to meet not even housing inflation, just inflation.
Just general inflation.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. So, well, thank you for the support. I was kind of disappointed, just kind of browsing around the internet to see that not many left-wing media outlets have been giving this particular strike a lot of coverage.
Nope, they haven't.
I saw a little bit of coverage of the Starbucks strike, which obviously, all solidarity to them. What they're doing is also amazing. But this is the largest strike of 2022. Why are people having to read about it in the Washington Post? Yeah. Why is the Washington Post, the New York Times, LA Times, and San Francisco Chronicle giving this strike more coverage than
Jacobin?
Than Jacobin. I mean, Jacobin has published an article. Yeah.
But
in terms of like podcasts, I was more generally.
Well,
very little.
Do you know how much I don't hear about union stuff on podcasts? And when I do hear it, and I hate to say this, when I do hear it, it's like, I can tell you've never seriously been in a union. Like, maybe you are in a union, probably the teachers union or some shit, or the professors union, but you've never attended a meeting. You're definitely not a rep. Like you don't see, you're just like, unions are magical. And I'm like, yeah, people, unions are super important and they're vital to what we do. It ain't fun. I will say that it is not fun. I mean, sometimes it's even like I'm arguing with my union to like have a meeting where I as a rep can come because I'm on slightly different contract hours than everyone else in the union. Is just like, can we, I don't know, like, can you like figure out how to do this where I can drive there? Or can you let me Skype in or something? Like, and like, well, we can't make special exemptions for you. I'm like, we have different contract hours. Like, but just to even small shit like that, and that's a very minor thing. Like, but you have to deal with it. And I think for a lot of people, it's not sexy, and striking sexy. I gotta admit, everybody likes a good strike. Well, unless you're a university administrator, then they don't like a good strike. But and it's important that this happens, and particularly in the United States. A friend of mine was like, I laughed at him because he's an American who's lived in Germany for like 20 years, and he was like, we're always complaining about people getting stuck in trade union consciousness, but dear God, if only people in the States would even do that. Like, and I'm like, yeah, it's kind of hard. The legal obstacles are quite daunting sometimes, actually. So like and subscribe, blah blah blah, but also support. I'd rather you give to this than me right now. So drop a couple of bucks down there. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you, Misha, for coming on. Thank you for tolerating my weird humanities divergence into Russian literary studies for no reason.
Always enjoy it.
I'm having some other people talk about it. I want one of the visions for this contrast is not just leftist stuff, but it's also increasingly like I am trying to fill in a gap of this cultural knowledge that just seems to be atrophying even on the left. And with Russia stuff particularly, it's like there's Sean's Russia blog, and I love Sean Guillory. Good. It's very good.
Yeah.
And there's like new books in what is it? New books in Russian and Eurasian something studies, I think, on the New Books Network, and that's it. Like, that's literally it. So
pretty much in terms of stuff that's in English.
And so if we learned Russian, it would be a lot easier. I know, but part of the problem that we're reaching here is we don't speak Russian. A lot more. I imagine it is still true that a lot more Russians speak English than the other way around.
That's definitely the case.
All right. Well, thank you, Misha, for coming on, and have a good night. Good luck, and I will do a follow up in a couple weeks, maybe a month. Hopefully, this doesn't last forever, but if it needs to, it needs to.
Columbia went for 10 weeks.
Okay.
So we're trying to beat them.
All right. So. maybe in a season we'll do a follow up and see how it went and see how you feel about the whole process, and maybe also talk more about the humanities. Best of luck to you. Solidarity.
Thank you.